25. Yesterday was a day of full excitement as participants over 25 languages met, exchanged ideas, and celebrated each other's decades long work in their own respective languages. And from an administrator translator's lifelong efforts in education, tribal languages, and Telugu literature, to a veteran journalist's initiative to build a multilingual rural archive, Day One brought together inspiring stories of commitment to language and culture. We also heard about challenges and innovations in low-resource languages, activism for inclusive language policies, and efforts to make the Indian language internet safer and more meaningful. So, taking that energy forward on the day two, today we hope to dive deeper into conversations around Indian languages in the light of product and technology. When we speak about product and technology, I would like to share three key thoughts from my side. So the first one, technology discussions should not revolve only around cutting edge technologies. It is very easy for us to think about a very cutting edge technology that everyone is going to speak about, and also in the scale of a global level. But technology conversations should also take into an account about the context, history, and the struggles of each languages that define what kind of tech and what kind of efforts that they are trying to make today. Second, technology is not just for coders and product managers. It might be a common understanding for a lot of us, but I just also want to put it up again. Technology is technology is every one of us business. Those who create glossaries, critique existing technology, build policies, and enforce policies, identify gaps, or simply worry about things that are non-existent in their own languages. Technology is all of us. And the third one, lastly, no one else should truly build for our language. No one else will truly build for our languages and contexts better than we do. While global and large players often design for scale and their own strategies, our communities must lead in informed engagement and active co-creation of the digital infrastructure essential to our linguistic futures. Technology doesn't come out of magic. People who think, work, and dedicate their lives to do it are the real magic. So with that energy, let us start day two with the shared spirit of ownership and collaboration. Before going into the program, I have few housekeeping announcements to make. Excuse me. There are few housekeeping announcements to make. Here is your Wi-Fi. Here is your Wi-Fi. If you have not connected yesterday, so please do connect today. And yeah, take a photo of it and use it for yourself. Next. And you can access schedule here and Wi-Fi. Done? The next one. Now the schedule, again same. Kindly access schedule here. Either take a picture or else go to the link directly. And the next one. This is Etherpad. Again, try to take a picture because like Etherpad is important for you to collate your questions. Sometimes we might have time to discuss questions, and sometimes we might not have time to discuss questions, but we want everyone to be heard. So the next one. And whoever leaving today, kindly make sure that you submit your honorarium forms and you submit your whatever that needs to be submitted to Medini ma'am. Please make sure that you are doing it today. And finally, if you are sharing about Bahu Bhasa, we request you to use this hashtag. It is not compulsory or necessary. It would be great if you can collate everything here. Okay. With these announcements, housekeeping announcements, I directly want to get into today's keynote, Technology and Indian Languages, Promise and Problems. Professor Arjun Ghosh, IIIT Hyderabad, he works on the digital humanities and mobilization, copyright and intellectual property, new media, and the politics of performance. He was formerly a fellow at Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla, currently teaches at IIT Hyderabad. Sorry very much. IIT Delhi. Yeah. He is an author of a history of the Jananati Manch, Place for the People, and Freedom from the Profit, and an annotated translation of Nabanya. He is the president of Dharti, Digital Humanities Alliance for Research and Teaching Innovations. And from my conversations with Arjun, I definitely know one thing. He is going to challenge a lot of ideas that we inherit and operate regarding languages, scripts, and technologies. With a lot of excitement, I would invite Arjun onto the stage.
I have known Pawan for some time, but I didn't know that he is a soothsayer. Yeah, I really want to express my happiness of being at IIT Hyderabad. I have followed the work of this institution for some while, and in a country, in an overall academia where turf protection becomes a very, very important academic duty for everybody. This is a place where turfs have been broken, be it in the programs in computational social sciences and in the arena of languages. So much work has happened here, as well as in computational linguistics. So this is a pretty exciting place for me to be speaking about some of my ideas. And I'm grateful to the organizers for extending this invitation to me. So I'm going to be, I've been involved to a certain extent in the development of optical character reading technologies, and I'm going to speak from the perspective of someone who has been involved in this work. And let us see whether I am able to provoke some ideas in your mind. So I'll largely be speaking from a script which is being put together. I will try to avoid tech bhasha as much as possible, but if there is, I would suggest if there is some term or some concept that I'm using which is immediately unintelligible. See, I come from a humanities background, so I'm not a tech person, but yet in order to, for shorthand, we might be using some technical language. Please put up your hand and stop me and ask me for a clarification. That's fine. Larger questions can be addressed later, but if you have, because it's very important that you understand what I'm saying, without which the concepts may not be clear. I promise that I will try to avoid tech bhasha as much possible. I also look upon technology with a broader sort of definition. So I would say the fact that some of us are using a pen or a pencil to write on a piece of paper, you are using technology. All right? So print also is a technology. Technology, the moment of technology does not begin with the digital, certainly doesn't begin with the moment of AI. And technology has always played a role in language. So I begin, language has never existed outside its material forms. Every epoch invents new ways of storing, transmitting, and regulating words, and in doing so, it reorganizes not only how people communicate, but also how they know. The oral tradition made language inseparable from voice, gesture, and memory. The manuscript introduced the idea of text as something that could be copied, edited, and commented upon. Print, when it arrived, transformed both. The page became a stable object, and authorship acquired authority. And linguistic variation began to seem like error rather than richness. Today, in the digital age, we are again at such a threshold, and our modes of speaking, writing, and reading are being reshaped by screens and code and algorithms. To think of language as infrastructure is to see it not merely as a medium of meaning, but as a scaffold of cognition and social organization. Scripts, typefaces, file formats, or voice interfaces are not passive carriers. They actively determine what can be said, stored, or retrieved. When a technology changes, the underlying structure of linguistic possibility changes with it. The history of South Asia is a particularly vivid example of this. Each technological shift, oral, manuscript, print, digital, has ordered the multilingual and multi-script fabric of the region. This lecture asks a central question. Can the digital era undo some of the rigidity that print introduced? And what role does technology play in the process? Colonial print culture created fixed pairs of script and language, standardized orthographies, and hierarchical distinctions, and created hierarchical distinctions between languages. These structures were absorbed into modern schooling, bureaucracy, and even now within digital systems. Yet new technologies, touchscreens, transliteration keyboards, and voice recognition seem to invite a return to fluidity, or at least technological possibilities exist. I will trace this movement from fluid pre-print multilingual worlds through the standardizing violence of print and colonial modernity to the current possibilities opened up by digital and AI-based tools. The aim is not nostalgia for the past, but an exploration of how technological design and cultural memory might work together to rebuild a more plural linguistic infrastructure for the future. Before print arrived in South Asia, language moved through looser, more permeable channels. Knowledge traveled orally through memory and recitation. Scripts were mobile, porous systems. The same story or ballad or royal order could appear in multiple scripts and languages without anxiety about fidelity or standardization. The Sanskrit of the court, the Prakrit of everyday life, the Persian of administration, and regional vernaculars could coexist in intricate ecology of translation and mediation. The boundary between speech and writing was thin, often crossed and recrossed through performance, recitation, and commentary. In the manuscript cultures of the subcontinent, the text was never a stable object. A scribe was not simply a copier, but a participant in meaning making. Each copy shaped by local orthography, regional pronunciation, or personal handwriting was also a new iteration. Writing systems themselves were flexible. A Sanskrit text could appear in the Bangla or the Grantha script. Persian chronicles might be retold in Hindavi for local reading and could possibly be expressed in the Mahajani script. The pairing of one language with one script, a rule we take for granted today, did not yet exist. What mattered was not uniformity, but circulation. This was a world that was held together by habits of bilingualism and translation. Poets and philosophers moved easily between registers. Administrative documents and devotional songs alike inhabited more than one linguistic identity. Multilingual literacy was common among scribes, merchants, and priests. While hierarchies of refinement certainly existed, Sanskrit over Prakrit, Persian over Hindavi, the idea of singular, pure language with fixed boundaries held little force before print. The manuscript world tolerated variation as a natural feature of language, not a corruption of it. There was a recognition that meaning traveled through mixture. Such an environment produced a very different relationship between technology and thought. The manuscript with textures of ink, the writing surface, and handwriting preserved variation as a natural feature of knowledge. It encouraged annotation, commentary, and dialogue across generations. To read a manuscript was to engage with a living, layered archive of decisions, omissions, and reinterpretations. This was the linguistic world that colonial print would confront and slowly reorganize. When print arrived, it did more than introduce a new medium. It imposed a new order of legibility. Scripts hardened, linguistic boundaries became visible, and the long history of fluid writing and reading practices was folded into a narrower, more standardized conception of language itself. When print arrived in South Asia, it did not come as a neutral technology of reproduction. It entered through the missionary press, the colonial administration, and later the nationalist publishers, each with their own logic of control, pedagogy, and persuasion. The printing press brought with it the European assumption that a language must have a single, stable written form, and that script, orthography, and grammar must be standardized. This was not simply a technology of adaptation. It was an epistemic reordering of how languages were imagined and governed. The various colonial presses began by producing religious tracts and grammars, translating the Bible into vernacular tongues. But translation here was inseparable from classification. To translate efficiently, one had to define what language was and separate it from dialects and decide which script would represent it. The Bengali, Oriya, and Assamese, which had long existed in shared scribal continuum, were thus divided and hierarchized. Hindi and Urdu, previously registered of a single linguistic field, or a kind of a nebulous kind of a linguistic field, I would like to avoid that word singular, were split among religious and script lines. Devanagari versus Perso-Arabic. These pairings were not innocent. They fixed cultural identities into the shape of type, the typeset. The colonial state's desire for enumeration and order reinforced this fixity. Census operations, school curricula, and textbook production all required clear categories. Children were to be taught in one language, textbooks printed in one script. A people were to be identified by a linguistic label that could be counted and compared. The press thus became an instrument of linguistic governance. What had once been a dynamic continuum of speech and writing was rendered into discrete, bounded units, languages with their proper grammars and dictionaries. The rigidity that print introduced did not dissolve with independence. If anything, it became institutionalized in the post-colonial state. Language was now not only a medium of identity, but a principle of administration. The linguistic reorganization of states in the 1950s tied language to territory with new bureaucratic permanence. Tamil Nadu for Tamil, Maharashtra for Marathi, Gujarat for Gujarati, school curricula, civil service exams, and broadcasting policies reinforced the idea of bounded, standardized languages. Newspapers and television were expanding rapidly from the 1960s onwards, reproduced these linguistic borders in the name of accessibility. Even as India celebrated its multilingualism, the infrastructure of communication continued to privilege uniformity, a legacy of print. In this new world, the flexibility of earlier scribal practice disappeared. A text now belonged to one language, one script, and one community. Deviations became errors, dialects became corruption. Scripts that once moved fluidly across linguistic and regional boundaries, such as Kaithi in Hindi, in the Hindi-Urdu belt, and Modi in Marathi, Kannada, and Konkani continuum, gradually fell to disuse as print standardized a one-on-one correspondence between language and script. The aesthetic of uniformity replaced the older aesthetic of variation. Multilingual world was still there, alive in speech, but on the printed page, it had been disciplined into singular forms. The digital revolution at least held the promise, I would say still holds the promise, of liberating the fixities of print. Text could now move across screens, morph into pixels, travel through code, and reappear in multiple fonts and formats. Yet the early decades of computing quietly repeated many of the assumptions of the print age. The machine required alphabets to be enumerated, characters to be indexed, and scripts to be standardized into codes, Unicode being one of them. The ASCII table, which represented only Roman letters and a few symbols, was a typographic echo of colonial print. The keyboard being the mediator. When Indian languages first entered the digital domain, they did so through transliteration, fragmentation, and substitution, clutched through the keyboard rather than born of it. Even Unicode, which eventually appeared to include global scripts, followed the same logic, a one-to-one mapping between sign and meaning, character and code. It secured visibility for the world's writing systems, but at the cost of compressing their internal variation. Complex ligatures, conjuncts, and regional letter forms were flattened into standardized glyphs, and what could be digitized easily survived. What resisted encoding risked obsolescence. The digital world, for all its dynamism, thus inherited print's foundational rigidity, its dream of universal legibility. Yet digital media have also introduced something genuinely new, interactivity. The screen is not merely a page, but an interface. What we type, we or tap or swipe, and we speak into the screen. Touchscreens and voice recognition systems are reintroducing the sensory dimensions of reading and writing that print had suppressed. A child dictating a message to a phone, or an elderly speaker dictating messages in regional language using speech to text. It gestures towards a return of voice as a primary mode of interaction. A modest but significant reversal of print, the print keyboard hierarchy. Transliteration keyboards allow writers to compose across scripts with ease. I'm not talking about like predictive text. If you turn off predictive text, then it will come into being. The digital, unlike print, can accommodate movement, the slip between the phoneme and the grapheme, between accent and spelling. Still, the return to fluidity is far from assured. The platforms that mediate our digital lives often privilege dominant, or what we call high resource languages, that is, languages which have greater sort of digital resources, be it Unicode, be it transliteration engines, be it natural language processing data sets, etc. And commercially viable scripts. These are the ones that dominate the digital lives. Automatic translation systems are trained disproportionately on English and a handful of high resource languages. Regional scripts remain underrepresented. Their digital futures contingent on institutional and community effort. In other words, the digital can either undo the hierarchies created by print or amplify them under new corporate logics. The question then is not whether the digital is inherently plural, but whether we can design it to be. The capacity for multimodality, text, voice, image, opens the door to older, more fluid traditions of expression. But without deliberate investment, inclusive policy, and culturally aware design, the digital revolution risks reproducing the exclusions it can potentially erase. We are poised once again between fixity and fluidity, between the lingering grids of print and the yet unrealized flexibility of the screen or whatever digital interface that may come to us in the future. We are now in a moment when artificial intelligence has begun to reorganize our relationship with text. The current wave of artificial intelligence, built on deep learning architectures, has redefined what it means for machines to see and read. The traditional computational systems depended on structure. They required clean data, consistent formatting, and predictable inputs. Deep learning, in contrast, learns from the irregular, the noisy, and the incomplete. It can work with smudged ink, slanted handwriting, overlapping scripts, or speech marked by accent and interference. It learns by example and not by rule. This shift is particularly consequential for language technologies in South Asia. Traditional OCR systems designed on the logic of print could handle only the tidy geometry of Roman typefaces or other typefaces which had similar kind of dimensions. They broke down when confronted with visual density of Indic Abugida scripts or the connected flow of the Perso-Arabic, the cursive, or in Abugida what you have, though it is left to right, it's also top to bottom, the way the vowels and diacritics, etc., are placed, right? Or the idiosyncrasies of handwriting. Deep learning introduces an entirely different logic of recognition. Instead of isolating each letter and matching it to a template, the convolutional or recurrent neural networks, and more recently, transformer-based models, process entire lines or segments of texts, learning visual and sequential patterns across them rather than treating each character in isolation. They detect relationship among pixels, strokes, and curves, inferring meaning from spatial and sequential patterns. This has three immediate implications. First, it allows us to recover complex scripts that earlier OCR systems could barely process. Indic scripts with their stacked diacritics and compound characters, and Perso-Arabic with its connectedness and variable shapes, can now be rendered into searchable text with far higher accuracy. Second, it enables us to work directly with handwritten material, from letters and notebooks to palm leaf manuscripts. Third, it makes possible the rescue of older, degraded media, noisy microfiche scans, blurred copies, or low-contrast archival images that would otherwise need costly rescanning. The implications for archival preservation and research are immense. In the Indian context, where vast portions of intellectual history remain in manuscript or poorly printed and printed form, or the digitization of that print is not very good always. This is not merely a technical advance, it is an opportunity. Deep learning offers a way to unlock centuries of records that were effectively excluded from the digital era or the digital presence. While Western AI systems have drawn upon extensive printed archives spanning several centuries, South Asia's printed corpus is comparatively recent, largely 19th and 20th century phenomena. The enormous textual wealth of the subcontinent, philosophical treatises, vernacular chronicles, regional newspapers, and personal correspondence exists primarily in manuscripts or fragile early print. So when we look at large language models and other AI systems within European languages, they would be training them for material for about 500 years, whereas ours are primarily trained over material which have appeared over the last 20 years in the born digital space, because Indian languages digitization is not there now. 20 years of data versus 500 years of data, the result is going to be starkly different. The ability to extract, transcribe, and index these materials has the potential to redress the historical data gap that has limited the inclusion of South Asian languages in AI models. Yet this opportunity also demands critical awareness. The corpus of manuscripts available for digitization carries its own social and ideological biases. Much of what survives was written and preserved by upper caste elites, institutions, and religious orders. To treat such material as transparent record of the past would be to reproduce those exclusions. The recovery of textual archives must therefore be complemented by the collection of oral histories and community-based records, maybe textiles and other forms of knowledge. We need to recognize that there's knowledge there as well. Testimonies that can counterbalance the caste and gender imbalances of manuscript tradition. Only when these layers of speech and writing are combined can AI-generated archives begin to approximate the diversity of lived experience. Technically, deep learning success in OCR arises from a change in the unit of analysis. Traditional OCR worked at the level of individual characters, as I said. The system attempted to isolate each letter, identify each shape, and match it against a reference set. This approach fails for cursive and Abugida scripts, where characters are context-dependent and often visually fused. More recently used deep learning OCR, by contrast, works at line level using the recurrent neural networks or transformer architectures, which will learn from entire sequences. So this shift in granularity has dramatically improved accuracy across complex scripts, especially when combined with language models that predict the likelihood of character sequences. However, the problem is not solved merely by technology. Creation of accurate models depends on ground truth data, manually transcribed, annotated samples that teach the system what each image represents. In India, finding experts capable of transcribing historical scripts or even modern printed regional texts is a major challenge. At least that has been our experience. For many languages, especially those written in older or variant scripts, such expertise is scarce. For example, when we started working on Urdu, we did find annotators who could annotate, let's say, documents that are about 100 years old. The moment we went to 19th century manuscripts or early lithographs, because the annotators could not recognize many of the words, they found it very difficult to annotate. And that's a challenge. Because in the printed world, the changes in spelling, shifts are slowed down. But moment you go into manuscript, the changes are much more fluid, and therefore shifts happen much quicker, right? Okay. So therefore, in India, so for many languages, especially those written in older or variant scripts, such expertise is scarce. Crowdsourcing, a common strategy in digitization projects, proves difficult here. Scripts are demanding, and the tasks are repetitive, and the volunteer base is uneven. So the pragmatic approach is to aim first for searchability and partial legibility. Even imperfect transcriptions can enable text indexing and linguistic analysis, which in turn support both humanities research and training of better AI models. Over time, as the corpus expands, models improve through feedback, through reinforcement. But for that to happen, work must be distributed equitably across languages and regions. Effort should be made. And this is where social imbalance intrudes once again. Experience from recent crowdsourcing projects that we have conducted at IIT Delhi shows a striking disparity in availability of volunteers and contributors across the Indian languages. It is relatively easy to find contributors for Hindi, about 42% of the respondents, followed by a moderate participation for Bangla and Malayalam, about 19%, Tamil, 10%, Assamese, 7%, and Marathi, 6%. Beyond that, the engagement drops sharply. Telugu and Kashmiri around 3 to 4%, and almost negligible participation for Kannada, Odia, Punjabi, Manipuri, Mizo, 1 to 2%. These differences may reflect multiple factors: uneven dissemination of calls for participation, differing levels of digital access, the uneven linguistic economy of attention, where some languages dominate institutional cultural visibility, while others remain peripheral. If deep learning gives us the technical means to recover complexity, we must also create social infrastructure to sustain it. Digitization cannot rely solely on automation. It depends on communities who read, annotate, and validate data. This calls for long-term investment in regional digital literacy, localized interfaces, funding models that reward participation in low-resource languages. It also requires a shift in mindset to value partial, noisy, and plural data as legitimate raw material for artificial intelligence, rather than privileging the clean, standardized corpora that repeated colonial patterns of knowledge. The promise of deep learning then is not just accuracy, it is inclusivity through imperfection. By learning from messy data, AI begins to mirror the texture of real language use, handwritten, hybrid, full of variation. In embracing this complexity, we move closer to the multilingual, multi-script reality that print once constrained. The task ahead is to ensure that this technological possibility translates into cultural practice, that the recovery of complexity does not stop at the level of code, but extends to the ethics and imagination of how we build our digital future. The recovery of complexity through deep learning is only half the story. The other half concerns design. Not merely the design of algorithms, but design of institutions, collaborations, and values. Technology alone cannot guarantee pluralism. The architectures of inclusion have to be built consciously, and they required slow labor of connecting engineering with the humanities, code with culture, efficiency with empathy. Plurality is not simply the coexistence of many languages on a digital platform. It is a way of thinking, a recognition that meaning arises in relation, not in isolation. The Indian linguistic world has always, South Asian I should say, linguistic world has always known this. Languages have survived not only by guarding their borders, but leaning into each other. A multilingual person does not translate between sealed containers. She moves through a continuum of sound and sense. To design for plurality is to then design for movement, to make systems that are porous, reversible, and tolerant of ambiguity. For engineers, this means departing from the fantasy of perfect automation. The human in the loop is not a temporary necessity until machines improve. It is the ethical and interpretive core of any responsible system. Every stage of language technology, from corpus building to OCR correction, from speech recognition to translation, depends on human readers who bring cultural knowledge to machines' statistical correlations. Instead of treating them as invisible labor, we must see them as collaborators who extend the intelligence of the system. For the humanities, the challenge is the inverse, to engage with these new infrastructures not only as objects of critique, but as sites of participation. Scholars trained in literature, linguistics, or history have a role in shaping data standards, metadata practices, and interpretive frameworks. When these disciplines remain outside the design process, the result is purely technical pluralism. A plurality of inputs without plurality of understanding. Plural design must also confront questions of equity, which languages receive funding, annotation, and testing, whose voices shape the benchmarks of accuracy. An inclusive digital future cannot depend on volunteer enthusiasm alone. It demands sustained institutional commitment. Universities, cultural bodies, and public archives must treat digitization not as a service project, but as a form of nation building, one that respects the linguistic and social diversity of citizens. To design for plurality is finally to recognize incompleteness as a virtue. The digital archive will always be partial, the algorithm always approximate, but incompleteness can also be generative. It leaves room for correction, translation, and reinterpretation. What we need are systems that preserve that openness, that remember within their logic the unfinished and many-voiced nature of human expression. Only then can technology begin to mirror the heterogeneity of the society it serves.
Thank you very much. So we are opening it up for questions.
That was really nice, Arjun. Thoroughly enjoyed this. Partly also because, for the last year or two, I've been trying to do a course called the Gutenberg Parenthesis, talking about a whole bunch of these things that you are talking about. But while the survey from what happened with the coming of print, the imprisoning of languages, the scripts and how all of that happened, language politics, is good. But at the end, when you were talking about what happens with AI, I think there's far more of an expectation from technology and from governments and from corporations or institutions which are building the technology, and we don't flesh out enough what we as people can do. And what that does is, over time, there is a sort of degrading of the agency of people, whether as individuals or as collectives. And I think there's far more responsibility, because agency also means responsibility. There's far more responsibility on us to engage and do things rather than merely demand and complain. And I think it would be good if you can think of what is it that we as the users, as the consumers, as the engagers, as the agents are not doing, what we should be doing, more self-criticism in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, that is there. I think
if there is any
if we go back to the moment of print, let us say, so there were these colonial missionary presses or the nationalist presses, but there were also presses like the Bottala, which were articulating a different kind of print culture, etc. Right? So all that is there, but ultimately, I feel so. I'll give you the answer in two parts. The first part is that we should not undermine the role of the government or the large funders or corporates or whatever. Because what I find is that the very basic structure of intervention is, whereas the technology permits a decentralization, a possibility of variation, the motivation of these the state agents is that of centralization. To push a certain kind of standard, let's say to push one particular script as the standard transliteration. So whereas it is possible, let us say, to build a translation system, automated voice translation system, where I am speaking in one language and you can speak in another, and when you speak, it translates back to me, that's not where the emphasis really is coming from. You would find that it is only one way. When I am communicating in my script, because I am the person in power, you should be able to understand me, not the other way around. That's where the emphasis comes, and you see that there is that kind of unitary push that is coming, and that reflects in the development of the infrastructure. What we see that actually when we call for annotators, I mean, people know the language, but they are not comfortable with the ICT compartment of that language, and that is something that is coming through the institutions, right? So I wouldn't sort of underplay the role of the bodies which are making these decisions, and it is important that we understand what is happening and critique it, in its fullness. On the other hand, sometimes I think it is important that we understand the technology very well. So these, I'll give you just one example which may not be very, I mean, it's something that comes to my mind straight away, but I mean, Wikipedia, for example. Wikipedia is as open a space as you can think of in the digital, right? I mean, in a sense, with its open standards and its ability to fork and everything, it's everything that you can think of, creating variability and distribution. Like just this week I was in class, I was doing something with Wikipedia, and I just went and made a change without even logging in, that kind of thing. That kind of openness and that kind of robustness. And lo and behold, the change got sort of reverted in 30 seconds. So that kind of robustness of that openness is there. But look at Wikipedia, even its language domains are mapped to that print script binary. And the digital doesn't require that, right? So I think there is greater need for movements like what is happening in this room to be able to open up that conversation, but what is the possibility of technology and what is the possibility from a human initiative? Unfortunately, post the Second World War and its interventions within academia, hiatus between sciences and the humanities have just grown. And probably, we are now probably going to see them coming together. And that's why my reference to IIT Hyderabad as a good venue was also there at the beginning.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really enjoyed your talk. Great to start off with today's whole day's AI and NLP discussions. I have two questions. One is not a question, basically. It's about the whole concept of sovereign AI maybe in India, because we are a lot dependent on other countries for algorithms or something else to start off with our systems. And that particular thing of being able to decompose something into our own languages. And yeah, that's number one. And how far do you think that's possible, if we ever think of it, and how long maybe it would take? And the second is your point where you said that we should probably go ahead and work with messy data and include it and see how AI takes care of it at some point. But I actually was thinking about it because when I was working with my students for some, sign language interpretation system, and we started off with some messy data, we had a lot of problems. So how much and what percentage maybe we should be taking as permissible? Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you for these questions. I think the question of data sovereignty is very, very important. And what has happened is that because of a lack of existing technological platforms, a lot of work just gets pushed to these multinational AI engines or whatever. And that just ends up making those in their database much stronger, because we do not have indigenously built data systems. So one of the experiments that we have done in IIT Delhi, our OCR system, which was being developed, Lipikar. So we are not going to be releasing that that model publicly, because it simply means that whatever work that we have done is just now going to be used by the multinationals, and they then have they just have outcompete us straight away. Instead of that, what we are trying to do is we are saying that we have optimized it into small devices, a Jetson device. So basically for interpretation, that's a device that instead of having to invest in a GPU of 25-30 lakh rupees, someone can invest in a Jetson device of about 2 lakhs, or even take it on rent, and do their archival transcriptions, the OCR, at their premises. So the data doesn't leave that premises at all, right? So these are the kind of models that we are thinking of, so that we are able to tide over. I'll give you another example. So when copyright came in, if you look at the history of copyright, initially copyright began individually in countries, then there were bilateral sort of agreements, and then there was the Berne Convention. Then you move to the Geneva, etc. But the big superpowers, whether the Soviet Union or the United States, didn't join any of these conventions till about the 1980s, till such time that they reached a certain knowledge edge. After that, they turned toward WIPO and those kind of things. So I think somewhere we will have to ensure data sovereignty in the way process. How are we able to? Yet we are able to develop a kind of a sanctioned space within which institutions can learn from each other. That is the challenge. And for that, again, we will have to look at institutional and state intervention in some level. This question of percentage of messy data is, of course, right. Yes. I mean, no. I mean, what happens is that. So I believe that if we are able to take the accuracy, and then accuracy is mapped here at 2 levels. One is at the character level or at the line level. If you can take a line level accuracy to about 95%. That's something that works well for computational textual work. And a human being to be able to read a page and figure out, like, okay, someone has made lots of spelling errors and stuff like that. It will read a student's work. It will read like that. And as far as NLP processing, it will give fairly accurate results, whether you're talking about place name detection, stuff like that, or topic modeling and stuff like that. But those topic modeling data sets will themselves need to be trained on accurate data. That has to have as close to 100% as required. Because that 95% of this and then 95% of that will translate into an 80% accuracy, which is not acceptable. So when we are training another model on top of one model, that time we will have to ensure that accuracy percentage is bridged as much as possible. That's very important. If that sort of answers your question.
I think it's... Oh, sorry, yeah. Professor Ghosh, I really liked your comment of one-to-one correspondence between language and script. So think sign meaning and character code. That was really a nice point that you brought up. You mentioned something about the crowdsourcing initiatives that public institutions are doing. I believe you gave examples of engagement drops, say for the languages like Manipuri, Mizo, Punjabi, etc. I wanted to understand what are the possible reasons that you came across for this low participation. That was one. Second, I come from academia, right? I work as a linguist. I spend most of my time with people from the Adivasi communities. And one of the critical feedback that I get from them is that obviously they do not have high expectations from any government, be it the current one or otherwise. But they do expect, say, from researchers, public institutions, including, say, IITs of our countries. One of the feedback that they always give us is that firstly they have this block because a lot is expected in the process of building a corpus from the community. But what are we providing them in return? That is one of the critical feedback that we get from them, which also demotivates them. We all can go into the technicalities, legalities of doing things, but for the community that has to survive daily and bring food on the table, their priorities is certainly not discussing how to build accurate corpus, right? So what are the public institutions like the IITs doing with the kind of funding that we receive to help the community document their languages rightfully?
So the reasons of crowdsourcing, unfortunately, we did not actually carry out any detailed feedback mechanism because those who fell off the radar fell off the radar. So we could not get back to, but we did try to have some initial training programs for tell people as to how to actually go about doing the transliteration, use a keyboard, how to install keyboard on them. So those steps we did, and in that process we figured out that it was far, far more the gap between, so let's say in a language like Hindi, a whole lot more people were comfortable in using transliteration engines. Whereas in some of these other languages like Odia, Ohomia, they were far, far more difficult. And we did not have the kind of funding. Ideally, what I would have liked to do is to go to some of these universities and all and hold maybe a day-long workshop and give hands-on training. Some of these things cannot be done digitally. You have to, when somebody, and one of the things that I find difficult in the digital environment is that if I am teaching a group of 50 people, in a physical classroom, I can go up to somebody and tell them that this is the problem. But in an online environment, people are not willing to share their screen with the rest of the class or something of that sort. So we would need much more funding support, perhaps greater incentives, etc., to be able to mitigate that. The gap in ICT usage between the knowers of the language, even the more advanced knowers of the language who had once filled up the form volunteering, but then dropped out. So that is a principal reason. And what is it that we can do in return? Well, I mean, at the present, of course, what we need to do is we need to take some of these. For example, our experience was that when we started the first language that we started with for our, we have now built models for all 22 languages, and some languages like Sindhi in multiple scripts, right? And Santhali also. But when we started with Urdu, which is counterintuitive, because that was the most difficult. But we took a conscious step that let us begin with that, which is where we have to walk the extra mile. With necessary funding support, we will be able to do all that match. Unfortunately, our the bigger initiative for the 22 languages came from a certain funding where this was not a priority. So I think priorities will have to be set. There will have to be funds set aside for local workshops and greater incentives. And of course, to the community, in a sense, it is a difficult thing, because you see, chances are that these low-resource languages are also low-resourced in terms of archives. So they wouldn't have an archive which has digitized records and stuff like that. So I can't even say that, okay, you take this Jetson engine and do the OCR. First, they have to take the digitization. So challenges are great. We can just keep articulating this. That's what I would like to say, yes.
When it comes to the AI tools and Indian languages, when it comes to the AI tools and technologies, Indian languages, so how to tackle the challenges of maybe the translation of the context or the concept? So because there are sometimes whether it might be wrong or it might be right. So how to tackle these kind of challenges?
You're talking about translation between languages. Okay, so I'm not very well versed in translation. Okay, but I think translation is an important approach. But I have been speaking of another approach. That is that, you know, if in the spoken world, not the one world which is solidified by print, there's a much greater fluidity between at least adjacent languages. And my understanding is that one can possibly take transliteration as an alternative approach to translation. Because when you translate, what you do, so even in translation, there is this debate as to whether to translate every word. Can we let a word remain? And so that it adds to the collective vocabulary. It enters into, because as I said, translating between languages as packets is not how we existed in the pre-print domain. My idea would also be to experiment with transliteration. That if we were to not translate some of the text but allow the users to actually access them in just another script, just like I think every language now is also written in Roman, right? In some form of way, either text message, etc. A similar way, there could be transliteration within Indian scripts. That would lead to at least a greater cross-linguistic understanding where there are like borderline areas, like between Bengal and Orissa, or between Maharashtra and Karnataka and all that. That will allow slowly to be able to, and that's possible with the digital. Slowly for concepts and ideas to percolate into each other instead of moving between packets. So I'm sorry, I probably don't have an answer to your question because I have not really worked on translations, but I just wanted to introduce this idea that transliteration is an approach that one could also look at.
Runa has a direct response to this question, and then we will take rest of the questions in deep.
Sorry, not about this question, an earlier comment that you made about the codes that we use at Wikipedia. So just wanted to call it out that we use the ISO codes for Wikipedia, and there's a very good reason for this. First of all, it's web standards, and interoperability is a very, very important issue for us to work across projects, across content, across all these sister projects and other issues. Another thing is that we have actually had very difficult situations getting rid of squatted codes. When initially things were not standardized, they were like one language using another language's code, and that used to cause a lot of problem. We are not in that era anymore. Things have changed. And also there are these, I totally recognize when you talked about the real world, the fluidity of the real world getting restricted by all of these standardization and other standard practices that we have to follow. There's also reasons around vandalism prevention. These kind of tools that we have to use on Wikipedia are reliant on these standardizations of the web standards that we have to follow. So just wanted to call it out, but also I want to be very curious about the kind of things that you see are getting prevented on a platform like Wikipedia because of these restrictions that you highlighted about. So that would be like a curiosity for me as well. Thanks.
On your first part, I don't need to respond. I think you understand the architecture of Wikipedia. We did, I was talking to Bodhi, we tried to see if we could use Wikisource as a validation model or even a training model for our systems. And we found that it was very difficult for our engineers, our research associates, to actually navigate Wikisource, because each language has its own script environment, and there is no way to sort of penetrate it by someone who is trying to work in 10 languages. And so that has been a challenge for us. Yeah. Thank you, Papa.
Thank you very much for Arjun and all the questions that we got. And yeah, here is the Etherpad, and you can record your questions here. And also, tea is ready, and you can continue the conversation. Thank you very much. And I quickly also would like to note that within 15 minutes we are going to be back here. Thank you.